So, yay! Does everyone have wine, by the way? I hope. Yes! Gosh, I love this group. It's quite lovely. So obviously today's topic, thank you all for coming. I have to admit, it might get a little geeky. It turns out that tannins are super interesting, and I'm really excited to do this webinar, or just have whatever this is going on. And the good news is, and the most important thing is, we all should have some wine, and I'm going to start by saying that this is the wine, just so we have it all, that I am drinking. For anyone who's not familiar, the reason I personally chose this wine is because it's made from 100% Nebbiolo, which, since we're talking about tannins, is pretty relevant. It's one of the grapes that has higher natural levels of tannins, so that's kind of fun. Yay! I'm so glad everyone's here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started and share my screen a little bit. So, so here we are. Can everyone kind of see the tannins, the beautiful tannin screen right here? Yeah? All right, cool, perfect. Then we're gonna go ahead and get started. So today's class is about tannins. And as I mentioned, tannins are pretty geeky. They don't have to be, but actually what I wanted to do with that is it tends to be kind of a misunderstood, or just not a very well understood component of wine, but it's so important. And the word is thrown around a lot, and it has a lot of adjectives. Like I said before, there's all these kind of like sexy words that you use to describe tannins, but like, what are we actually talking about, right? And so I thought it would be really fun to kind of explore that. If anyone's a Philip Pullman fan, this is my reference. Cheers to Wine's Dark Materials. So just getting started with this in particular. So the fun thing about tannins, literally when we're talking about tannins, you often may hear it when people are talking about describing wines, et cetera, but tannins themselves are actually chemical compounds that are found naturally in a variety of different plant life all over the place. Tannins are a group of chemical compounds called polyphenols. So they're a subgroup of the polyphenols, and they are actually a group of sort of bitter, astringent compounds that exist essentially in plants so that animals don't eat things that are underripe or that don't eat things that are bitter. So it's that natural old instinct of it tastes bad, don't eat it, right? And that's essentially where tannins come from and why they exist in plant life. The other fun thing, I mean, they occur not just in wine grapes, which is obviously what we're going to talk about mostly, but there's also this, lots of other fruits and vegetables and items in nature have tannins. So that would be, for example, oak, rhubarb, walnuts, tea, which is one really important one that I talk about a little bit later, coffee, cranberries, cacao, so chocolate, and of course grapes. But wood tannins and bark tannins and plant tannins in general are what humans have used for centuries to tan hides. So it's the same family of compounds that we find in our grapes that are essentially used to cure these animal skins, and they have been forever. So it's interesting, and we'll talk about this too, but one of the things that makes tannins so noticeable, especially in our mouth, is that they are water soluble. And they kind of, the way it works with tanning in hides is that the tannins actually go in, displace the water in between the actual skin fibers, and allow them to connect and make it essentially weatherproof and waterproof. So it's a really interesting chemical reaction that the tannins kind of initiate through the process. And it's on a smaller and similar scale in our mouth, but not quite to that degree. So, but the name for the tanning process actually comes from tannins, which is, makes sense because it's pretty obvious. But when we talk about tannins in wine, we're talking about the structural elements of wine, and also kind of a natural component, not just used for identification, but also used for longevity in wine. So tannins have the twofold purpose of creating sort of an experience or something that we associate with. It also has a purpose in wine of sort of making it ageable. Tannins actually have natural antioxidants in them. They have subgroups, tannins, the polyphenols of tannins, called flavonoids and non-flavonoids, which are really fun words to say. And one of the flavonoids that are in tannins is something called anthocyanins. And anthocyanins are what actually create the color in grapes. So these are important when we talk about them, but they have sort of an antioxidative property. And when you talk about wine, oxygen is essentially the complete enemy of wine, right? Because that is what turns it into vinegar, essentially. So the presence of tannins can actually help slow that process, both during the wine making period and also after the wine is made and is in bottle. So it has a dual purpose and many other purposes when we're talking about wine. So where do tannins come from? Wine tannins, pretty much most of the wine tannins that we really associate with come from the grape itself. So you have this beautiful picture here. I'm sure you all love it. I did that myself in Illustrator. But we have, not the full thing, but we do have the three main components of where the tannins are found in the grape. And it is in the stem of the grapes, it's in the seeds of the grapes, and it's in the skin. So these are the concentrated areas where you're going to find most of those tannins. And in particular, the skin is where you're going to find the majority of those anthocyanins that are giving it color. Now, there are different kinds of anthocyanins, but the ones that we are most associated with are the ones that turn the grapes red. So the different grapes, there are so many different varietals, right? There's over 2,000 different grape varietals that we use to make wine. But each of those grapes is going to have a different natural amount of tannins based on the structure of the grape, based on what grape it is, the thickness of the skin, the deepness of the color. So you'll find that in particular, some grapes will have like Cabernet Sauvignon or like Tannat. These are grapes that tend to have thicker skins and deeper color and have the potential to have more tannins extracted from them. And there are lighter grapes with lighter skins or thinner skins, like when we talk about Pinot Noir or Grenache. These grapes tend to be lower on the natural elements of tannins. So like when you taste them side by side, it seems pretty obvious because you're like, well, they're two completely different wines. And this is one of the reasons that that changes. But the other interesting thing, though, beyond just the grape itself, where the grape is grown is going to have an effect on the concentration of those tannins overall in the wine, in the potential of those tannins in the wine, right? So this is mostly a direct result of two elements, sun and heat. These are the elements needed for phenolic ripeness. So we talk about tannins are polyphenols. When we talk about wine, you'll hear the term sometimes phenolics. And this is what we're referring to, the phenolic ripeness of a grape. That's going to be, are the tannins ripe and are the colors full? And that phenolic ripeness happens at a different rate than the sugar ripeness in grapes. So sure, like sunlight is necessary, nutrients for the grape to create the berry. And then most of that juice, like most of the pulp is mostly water, right? And sugar. And that sugar is what will eventually be turned into alcohol. In hotter climates, you're going to get a higher amount of sugar ripeness in your grapes, generally speaking. And in cooler climates, you're going to get a slightly lower amount of sugar ripeness in your grapes, which tends to be why grapes and wines from cooler climates tend to be higher in acidity. And actually, the quality of the tannins tastes different as well. Because the hotter the climate, the hotter the environment, the sort of riper those tannins will get more quickly. This is why things like grapes like Syrah and Shiraz, right? Syrah from the Northern Rhone and Shiraz from Australia. The Barossa Valley in Australia, a really, really hot area, the tannins get very developed there and they tend to come out softer, a little bit less bitter, right? Whereas if you ever have a Northern Rhone Syrah, you know those tannins are not what we would describe as soft. We would describe those as sort of more structured, much firmer, and possible with a slight bit of astringency. Another grape that I see this with a lot too, when I think about, is Cabernet Franc, right? If you have a Cabernet Franc from California, for example, where we tend to be a warmer climate, the tannins are usually pretty velvety and pretty smooth. But when you then have that same grape from the Loire Valley, for example, where it's a lot cooler and you have a lot less sunlight overall during your growing season, you tend to notice those tannins a little bit more as being kind of firmer and more astringent. And that is a natural result of the overall climate and environment that the grapes are being grown in. So that's a really important part. The main goal for any winemaker is going to be to make sure they have balance in their grapes and in their wine. And that means being able to manage those tannins from vineyard to the winemaking process, which is the second part of how tannins are going to be developed into the end product of the wine. Because just because you have, you know, a Cabernet grape does not mean that all Cabernets are created equal. Of course, we know that. And it's not just about where the grape is grown, but also how it's made. So when we talk about tannins in winemaking, for example, there's a few really, really important components that will either accentuate and increase the tannins or decrease tannic quality in the finished wine. This is where I'm going to talk a little bit about red winemaking, which I think for the most part, all of you probably know, but just for fun, we'll kind of go over it again. When you're making red wine, the skins are used during and before the fermentation. So the grapes are pressed, the juice is released, the grapes are crushed, forgive me, the juice is released, and then the juice sits in contact with the skins, which is where the color and the tannins come from. Now, this is why we usually refer to tannins in red wines, because white wine is made differently. The juice is pressed off of the skins are removed, for the most part, before fermentation begins, so it has little contact and little opportunity to extract those tannins. But for red wine making, as we can see in the PowerPoint slide ahead, you have those skins, you have those grapes themselves, and that is continuously integrating tannin and color into the wine. Now, there's ways to increase this extraction, is what we call it, and also to decrease it. So some winemakers will do something called a cold soak, and that essentially means that they let the juice sit with the skins in a cooler environment, and that prevents fermentation from starting, because yeasts will not start to ferment until they reach a certain amount of heat. They need a certain heat level to kind of get going, right? But if you'd like to more gently extract some color and more gently extract tannins, you can do a cold soak, a cold maceration, before you let the fermentation process start. And why is that important? Because once fermentation starts, a couple things happen, of course. The yeasts are eating the sugar and they're turning it into alcohol. And they're also creating carbon dioxide and heat. So both alcohol and heat are solvents, and tannins are water soluble and alcohol soluble. So the more alcohol, the increase of alcohol makes the tannins kind of leach out faster and the color leach out faster. So once you start, and so does the heat, it speeds up the process. So once fermentation starts, the extraction can get a little bit more aggressive, and it will get more aggressive than if you're just doing the cold soak. So that way a winemaker has the opportunity to kind of decide how much tannin and how they're extracting it, and how that will end up creating the final wine that they want to make. So another thing that some winemakers will do, and you'll see this a lot more in grapes, in wines with grapes that tend to have less natural tannin, but that's the whole cluster fermentation. So the whole cluster fermentation is where literally what it sounds like. They chop those whole clusters off, they put them in the fermenting vats, and then the juice has contact not just with the skins, but also with the stems. And as we talked about, the stems contain tannins as well. So you're gonna kind of increase that extraction through the tannins. And a lot of times you'll see this done with Pinot Noir, for example, because winemakers may want to add a little more structure to that wine. They want a little bit more tannin present because naturally it's a little bit lower. And so that's one way that they have to do that. The other thing that is going to have a big impact on the amount of tannin extraction is what they call cap management in the winery. So that lovely top picture is also of the giant vat with red grapes in it. And what we're looking at is what is called the cap. So during fermentation, while the yeasts are creating all of that carbon dioxide is pushing the skins and the stems and whatever it's fermenting on to the top of the vat. And then you have that whole cap, and that's called the cap, exposed to the air, but it has less contact with the juice, which means you're not going to be able to get as much color and tannin from those skins and stems. So what do winemakers have to do? They have to reintegrate the cap into the fermenting juice. And they can do this in a few different ways. One way they do it is called punch down. This is the gentlest technique. The French term for it, they all have fancy French terms, is pigeage, and it's punch down. And this is the picture where you see people who actually, like, it looks like they have giant batons and they're just like shoving the skins down. It's actually really hard work because that cap can get really thick and heavy. And so you need a lot of elbow grease to kind of get it down, but ultimately they're using a paddle to, or you can do it with machine as well, but often it's done by hand, to push that cap down into the juice again so that it can continue to interact with the juice. Another process for cap management is something called remontage in French, and that's the pump over technique. That is where they stick a hose at the bottom of the fermenting vat and then spray from the bottom of the vat onto the top of the cap, basically wetting the cap from the top and allowing it to soak through. This process is a little less gentle, it's a little bit more aggressive, but it also starts to introduce a lot more oxygen to the wine, if you think about it, because that oxygen, the wine is coming out of the hose onto the cap. So if you have some varietals react more strongly to oxygen early, and you need to understand what grape you're using, how it interacts with oxygen, to choose this kind of technique that you want for your grapes in order to get that cap back in with the juice. The third way, and this is probably the most aggressive way, is délestage, which is better known as rack and return. And that's essentially where they draw all of the juice out of the barrel and then pour it all back over on top of the cap. And this is the process that you get the most oxygen interaction with. So again, being knowledgeable and being aware of that when you're choosing which technique is going to be critical based on your grape varietal. And then, of course, because oak is a plant and a tree, oak barrels actually have tannins in them naturally, as do oak staves and oak chips, which are other components that winemakers will use to introduce complexity to their wines. But the majority of the tannin in the wine itself is likely to come from the grapes. That being said, tannins from the oak can integrate themselves into the wine. And you have to be careful about this. And this is where we can see kind of overuse of oak, because the wine that is going into oak barrels, for example, or even being integrated with oak staves, that sort of virgin fermented wine before it goes in contact with the oak needs to be pretty powerful on its own to withstand the that kind of oak integration and what the influence of that oak is going to have. So if you have kind of like weak or flabby wine and you put it in oak, that's where you're going to end up with wines that basically taste just like vanilla powder or something. This over prominence of those oak flavors of spice, vanilla, clove, or possibly dill, depending on what kind of oak you're using. So it's really important to know that your wine quality has to be pretty high before you put it into oak to make sure that it can mitigate those additional components pleasantly. So how do we identify tannins? So this is another geeky fun thing. This is how tannins work. Tannins are actually, they bind to proteins. And as it turns out, saliva is a lot of protein, and that's what makes it kind of slippery in our mouth. So when we have tannins in our mouth from drinking wine, it binds with the proteins in the saliva and creates this drying, puckering kind of sensation. And if you don't know what that feels like, or if you don't know what that tastes like, what I recommend is if you oversteep black tea. If anyone's ever done that, and then you drink it, and you basically feel like you're chewing on a cotton ball, and it's kind of like so bitter and like astringent, and it lasts there for days. That's tannin. So that's tannin in its sort of most aggressive form, and that's essentially what winemakers are using as an element in the entire profile of their wine and how they want that to integrate with the other elements that they're making. So that is basically how we perceive tannins in our mouth when we're tasting wine, is that drying effect. And now that can be mitigated by other things like the acidity in the wine or the sugar level in the wine. That can change it a little bit. It can also be what makes red wines with tannins go well with some foods and not go well with other foods, because essentially that act of binding to the proteins and creating that drying effect is creating a whole new environment in your mouth and how your mouth is going to perceive the next flavor to come into it, right? So that is part of why they say tannic red wines go well with steak, because steak is mostly protein and it sort of sucks up all of those tannins itself, so suddenly you're left with just the fruit, which is really an interesting concept. But tannins also provide that texture, so that essentially what we're talking about is a mouthfeel. And when we talk about tannins, usually those descriptors that we use are textural. You think of things like smooth, velvety, harsh, coarse, you know, all of these kind of adjectives that really relate to textures, because we're describing, or we're trying to describe what that sensation and the level of that sensation in our mouth as we're tasting the wines. And tannins can also kind of give you an indication to other factors of the wine as well, which can be style, as in, did that winemaker want a lot of tannins? Did they use a lot of extraction? Or the age of the wine, because over time, the tannin molecules actually bind together in the bottle. And then as they get bigger, that's when they become less drying. They don't bind as much to proteins because they're stuck to each other. And so that's what softens the tannins over time in the bottle as they age. And that is also basically when they get big enough, those tannins become solids and then fall to the bottom of the bottle. So that is what the sediment in like old bottles of wine at the bottom of the bottle, that's essentially your tannins and the color that have precipitated out of solution, bound together over time to form large molecules and basically fall out of the wine and to the bottom of the bottle. But what that does overall is essentially creates a softening expression of the wine, because there are fewer tannins when you taste it later, because they've all fallen out of precipitation or become larger. And that's the process of the evolution of tannins as in the aging of wines that kind of changes that sensory quality to it. So softer tannins may be an indication of the age of the tannins if they have had the chance to polymerize like that. The other thing is just that tannins add complexity, right? Because this sensation in your mouth is going to create other reactions in how it interacts with the other components of the wine. And so the added complexity that tannins give is an important thing to note, especially when you're tasting wines and evaluating wines. So now that we kind of know what tannins are, and we talk about them all the time when we're talking about red wines, the question is, how do we describe them? And the important thing is that whenever you're evaluating a wine, it's all about balance. So the most important thing about tannins is that they should never be overly prominent, right? No one element in wine should be overly prominent. If you're tasting wine and you taste one thing, be it good or bad, but it's just one thing and it's overpowering, generally we don't think of that as a good thing, and we think of that as being kind of out of balance. And that can happen if there's too much tannin in the wine. Now, that being said, some wines are naturally very, very tannic and need a little time in the bottle to allow them to soften to make them ideal for drinking. But if you're tasting and you're testing and you're trying to go on to your wine courses, it's important to know that a good quality wine is still a good quality wine, whether it's young or whether it's old. So before the tannins have been able to kind of resolve themselves ideally versus when it's aged. So tasting a young Barolo, for example, which tends to be very, very tannic and not necessarily pleasurable to drink, you should still be able to evaluate those tannins and understand that that is a quality structure, a quality wine, regardless of the fact that it's just youthful. So, but for the most part, when we are all drinking wine, what you want to ask yourself is this: are the tannins overly prominent, and are they coarse? Like, are they really, really rough and harsh? Or are they well integrated? And you'll know right away. You'll kind of be like, no, this is, I have some tannin, I have some fruit, I've got the acid. This is all well integrated. This is balanced. The tannins are balanced with the overall wine. And that's what you're looking for a quality wine. And then I often reference this, is that when I think about tannins, I think about sandpaper. It's a pretty good reference because it's kind of, that's the level too. You think about those grades of sandpaper from the very, very coarse, that super, super fine grain. And that's the same way, kind of when you're tasting the wine, you can associate those tannins and describe them in your mouth. And some typical words that we use for descriptors, things like green or harsh can sometimes indicate that those tannins aren't right, that the grapes were picked too early, that those tannins are just too bitter and too astringent. And so when you hear those terms, that's usually what they're referring to, is kind of like an underripe quality to the tannins. Firm or grippy, right? Those are fun ones, totally kind of like really all over the place. But in general, these are tannins that are going to be very noticeable. Like, you definitely get tannin when you're tasting the wine, but it's pleasant. It's still balanced. You still find that good kind of noticeable balance between the tannin element and the rest of the wine, even if it's youthful, for example. And then words like polished or elegant, this is that reference to when it's super smooth and velvety in your mouth. This can be because of age. This can be because maybe it's a lower tannin wine, or those tannins themselves are just polymerized or processed in such a way that makes them really smooth, fine-grained, elegant. It sort of speaks for itself. So finally, this is our last slide, but just some grapes in general, like I recommended to people for whatever you guys have. Cabernet Sauvignon and Nebbiolo are some very naturally tannic grapes. As we know, as we've learned, of course, tannins are not just from the grapes, but also through the process of winemaking. So some grapes may have a higher potential for tannin, but still not have a lot of tannin based on how they're grown or how they're made. But Cabernet Sauvignon, Nebbiolo, Tannat, Syrah, these are all kind of higher levels of tannin. And then wines that have a lower level naturally are going to be grapes like Gamay, Pinot Noir, Barbera, Grenache. These guys are going to be really light. They'll tend to have a really, really delicate tannic structure. It will still be there. And depending on where it's coming from, it may be stronger or it may be softer. But generally speaking, these will have a lesser degree of tannin. And then finally, just a quick reference to white wines and tannin. I know I said that obviously since they're made off the skins, they don't have as much tannin, but of course, there are things called orange wines, right? And these are essentially white wines that are left in contact with the skins before or possibly partially during fermentation. And it's the same process. Like that leaches out the tannins from their skins, albeit there's a lower level, but they're present. So if anyone has had an orange wine and they've had that experience, it's tannins and white wine, and you're like, what am I drinking? And it can be, you can like it, you can hate it. It is what it is. But there are some white grapes like Riesling, for example, or aromatic grapes, Gewürztraminer, where they tend to more often do a little bit of a cold soak for those guys to help extract some of those aroma compounds, a little bit more of those aroma compounds out of the skin. So those are naturally aromatic varietals, and they're just trying to accentuate those aromas as best they can. So you'll see some white wines that tend to have a little bit of skin maceration naturally. Also, white wines aged in oak will naturally get a little bit of tannin from that oak, just as we talked about. So that, my friends, is what we call that. So I am, ta-da, that's it. So for right now, I'd like to say cheers. I will go ahead and unmute everybody. So hopefully we can all say cheers and ciao to each other. Oh my gosh, there's 55 people here. That's so great, you guys. I really appreciate you all coming. Thank you.
Sasha, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. So I've always had some allergies, and I didn't drink red wine for a long time until I was told by a winemaker that it's a reaction to the tannins and that they adhere to the fat in food.
Yes, and you know, this happens a lot. It's a great question, and I was hoping someone would ask, because people do reference tannins as a reason for why they get headaches sometimes or migraines. And there is a portion, it can be a combination of things. So first of all, tannins, which are already there in the wines, if you have a natural allergy to it, it can definitely cause and sort of trigger migraines or headaches in general. A lot of times though, it tends to just be the amount of wine that we're drinking. It's just reality.
Yeah,
but it is that fact that like when you're eating foods that are fatty or have protein in them, the tannins are going to connect with that food and therefore not necessarily react the same way to you personally. But it's a very personal thing. It's hard to really pin down exactly what causes the headaches for people, because some people it is the tannin.
I don't get headaches. Fortunately, I can drink wine and I don't get headaches. What it is the whole back of my nose like closes up and I feel like I can't swallow.
So that's another thing. That sounds like a histamines, because it'll actually release some histamines sometimes as well, and people will have reactions based on that. So I would be interested. I don't know. I'm not really a doctor, so I wish I knew. But that is kind of, in the very basic research I've done, there is sort of a release of histamines that can happen from drinking red wines sometimes.